three of us today will be mostly talking about our mercury work and our water quality work.
Why is mercury a problem? People hear things about mercury, but why should we be concerned about it?
Yeah, well, it's definitely been in the news a lot lately for people who've been paying a bit of attention to the media. Mercury is basically the most common cause of fish consumption advisories around the U.S. There are 43 states that have some type of mercury fish consumption advisory around in the U.S., including Michigan. We'll hear about that in a little bit. Mercury is it's a natural element, so it's always been around, but human activity has really increased the amount of mercury in the environment. So now that we have threats to both human health and wildlife, now that we didn't have as in the same extent before human activities started altering the mercury cycle. Mercury can pose threats to human health, including threats to, in particular, threats to children. Women of childbearing age who consume fish that's contaminated with mercury and then can pass that mercury onto the fetus during gestation, and then the children that are born then can potentially have impairments in such as memory, language, attention impairments that are related to that mercury exposure that they got in utero. And that potentially it's substantial numbers, as much as 320,000 babies born a year in the U.S. are at risk from mercury-related impacts due to exposures in the womb. And there are also actually threats to adults as well from mercury exposures, potentially increase in cardiovascular risk for anglers actually who consume much or higher amounts of fish due to the mercury contamination. There's been studies in Finland that have looked at that issue and a few other places. So we're looking at threats both on the early age to young children and risks to people middle-aged and older, potential cardiovascular risks from mercury exposure. And then also there's the threats to wildlife, loons, otters, mink, basically any wildlife that's eating fish relatively, and so up more to the top of the food web, is at a higher risk of mercury exposures and potentially mercury effects, where the effects are somewhat similar to those seen in humans, but more on the reproductive end. The success of reproduction of, say, loon chicks is impaired when they have higher mercury exposures. So we have both risks to human health and to wildlife because of mercury.
I want to ask you more about that in a minute, but Brian, you are quite an angler, as I understand it, and one of the main ways that we find out about mercury pollution is through the fishing advisories. What can you tell us about that? What's been your experience? And
certainly the fish advisory is probably the most well-advertised impact of mercury, in the Great Lakes anyway. They've been around for probably all of our lifetimes, maybe not Zoe's, but 30 years or so that we've, and really the entire time that the Great Lakes has been in a restoration mode. When in our childhoods, where the lake area was the dead lake, and we saw the Cuyahoga River burn, and then in the early 70s with the Clean Water Act, we saw that rebound of the Great Lakes to now, one of the best fisheries in the world. We have an $800 million a year recreational industry around the Great Lakes, and all of the tourism that comes with it. So we've done all this wonderful progress. But we still have this kind of this mercury cloud that's never been fixed. So my entire life on the lakes has been with a fish advisory pamphlet when you show up at the bait store, and the concerns that come along with that. How many fish do I eat? Should I be doing this? Should I be doing that? And the risk that has done is we have grown up with that, and because the effect is not direct, I don't eat a fish today and feel mercury something tomorrow, that it is so disconnected. It's very real, but it's so disconnected. We've become numb to the fish advisories.
Right, it's a cumulative problem. It accumulates in the body.
Exactly, and it may not affect me. Probably won't affect me at all, but now, as you get more educated, you think back when my wife was pregnant, and what was the impact to the child? And then again, it's such a indirect effect, and so many other things could affect it. We know that it's bad. A persistent neurotoxin through your body is not good, But the problem has been that since we haven't felt that direct effect, and you can see it on some of the sporting shows, is I've been eating fish for 30 years and I eat 3 times a week and it hasn't hurt me. But what we haven't made the connection yet is to go all the way back to where it does show the effect. And the frustration with all the other work is here's one of the many problems that the Great Lake which still faces that's absolutely fixable. And so that's what makes it in perspective with all the other things going on.
Are there some fish that are more safe to eat than others from the Great Lakes, or is it safe to eat? I mean, the advisory, as I understand it, the most recent advisory I heard, I believe, covered all fish.
Right. Well, it's actually, there's a statewide advisory in Michigan that covers not all fish, but a number of the inland fish species: walleye, largemouth, smallmouth bass, crappie, muskie. And that's restricted both for women of childbearing age and young children to no more than 1 meal a month, and then to the rest of the population to 1 meal a week. So that has been in place for a while, since 1988. So it's not all fish, but it's quite a few species, including some popular sport species. So it's still an issue. There are some of the panfish, sunfish, other fish typically have lower mercury levels. In general, mercury bioaccumulates up the food chain. So in general, the top predator fish are going to have the higher mercury levels than the fish that are lower on the food chain, and also smaller fish as well.
Is that because mercury doesn't pass through the body?
No, well, it does, but it just takes a while. It tends to accumulate in fish and in the muscle tissue of fish. That's why with mercury in fish, you can't, in properly cleaning the fish and removing the fatty tissue, you do eliminate some of the PCBs and some of the organic contaminants in the fish. And so that's good in terms of reducing exposure to those, but it doesn't, the mercury mostly gets in the muscle tissue of the fish, so you can't really lessen your exposure much by properly trimming the fish. So it's still a problem with even when you're properly trimming the fish and exposures.
Yeah, I think one important thing to stress is that we certainly agree with many other, with medical practitioners who would say that fish is very healthy food. People wonder how the mercury that comes from a coal-fired power plant and gets into the air ends up in our fish. What happens is when mercury air pollution comes from industrial processes, it falls through the rain into our lakes, our streams, our ponds. Once it's in our water bodies, bacteria in the sediment turn it into a far more toxic form called methyl mercury. Once it's in that form, small fish eat the plankton with the methyl mercury in them. Larger fish eat those smaller fish, until by the time it gets into some of our big predatory fish like a walleye, the levels of mercury in that fish can be up to 1 million times greater than the level of mercury in the water itself. And it's important to stress that mercury is one of those problems that we know what to do to solve the underlying problem. And it's very tempting to say there are these fish advisories out there, I'm going to solve the mercury problem by not eating fish. And I think it's important to stress that that's not a viable solution. It's not a viable solution for many people from a health standpoint, and nor should it be for our culture and for our environment. It's certainly not viable for fish-eating mammals or fish-eating birds. Right. They can't say, oh, well, I'll have a hamburger today. That's not a choice for them. And since we know how to remove mercury pollution from the environment, that's really the only way we'll solve the fish consumption problem.
Is that what the Clean the Rain program is about? Can you tell us what that is?
Sure. As Mike mentioned earlier, our branch of the National Wildlife Federation has been concerned for a long time about toxics in the Great Lakes. But in recent years, we've looked primarily at mercury. One thing that's important, one thing we've done over the last couple of years throughout the Great Lakes states is to do sampling of mercury in rain. And this might seem odd because the amounts of mercury in rain, they're not going to hurt you if the rain falls on you or if you drink rainwater. But it's an important way of showing how mercury gets into our environment, because most of the mercury that ends up in our lakes and in our fish isn't coming out of the pipe of a plant. People think of it as that way. It's in fact mercury air pollution that's released by industrial processes, primarily coal-fired power plants today. but then drops through the rain into our water bodies. We think of rain as being clean and pure, but because of industrial air pollution, this is not really the case. What this chart shows is the results of sampling we did for mercury in rain in communities across Michigan. On the left, we see the high levels of mercury we found even in some of our most pristine areas on the banks of Lake Superior. These levels are many times higher than the short bars you see on the right, which are the levels the EPA considers safe in the waters of the Great Lakes. So instead of cleaning our lakes and streams, what this shows is that the mercury in rain is actually contaminating them. Is how do we address the sources of pollution that end up as environmental pollutants that affect wildlife and human health?
Right, okay. Dr. Murray, what are the sources of mercury in the environment?
Well, as Zoe mentioned, that we're primarily concerned in both Great Lakes and a number of other water bodies with mercury that comes in through the atmosphere, because in most water bodies, either they don't have a direct industry right on them discharging mercury-containing waste, or they're remote and the only sources of mercury are from the atmosphere. And so looking at the air pollution sources are an important part of understanding the mercury problem.
Mercury isn't really used in the manufacturing process, is it?
Well, actually it is. It's used in some. It's used in certain plants that produce chlorine and caustic soda. Certain chlor-alkali plants use mercury in the process, the mercury cell process. And in fact, they're one of the biggest consumers of mercury in the U.S., on the order of, say, 30 to 50 tons of mercury a year, which is quite a bit of mercury. But they have actually decreased the amount of mercury they've been using through a voluntary program for the last 10 years or so. But they are big consumers of mercury. And then mercury is obviously used in thermometers, blood pressure devices, other medical equipment, electronic equipment, and computers, and fluorescent lights. And mercury is in those products. So there are still actually quite a few products that use mercury. But fortunately, a number of manufacturers have started phasing out mercury, looking into alternatives to mercury-containing products. In fact, we've promoted that through a guide that we put out a couple years ago on alternatives to mercury-containing products.